Hey everyone, welcome back to Medieval Historian. Or, if this is your first time here, strap in, because tonight we're going somewhere you won't find in your average history book. This video is all about the dark, greasy underbelly of medieval eating habits, the stuff people grabbed off the street, stuffed into their mouths, and immediately regretted. We're talking about the so-called junk food of the Middle Ages. The pottage, pies, pastries, and proto-snacks that did things to the human body modern nutritionists would have nightmares about. Today, when we say junk food, we mean chips, soda, donuts, stuff loaded with preservatives, but also flavor, texture, and sometimes even nostalgia. But in medieval times, junk food meant whatever was cheap, fast, and slightly less rotten than the dog lying next to it. And your body? Oh, it paid the price. Bad teeth, bloated bellies, infected guts, and that was on a good day. So, before we begin, and before you get too comfortable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? I'm just a nerd who loves digging into history's darkest corners, and it always blows my mind to see people tuning in from all over the world. You guys make this journey even more amazing. Now, let's dive into tonight's story. What medieval junk food did to your body. Imagine you've just stepped off a muddy road, your boots soaked, your stomach howling, and the only thing standing between you and starvation is a rickety wooden cart operated by a man who hasn't bathed since last harvest. Welcome to the snack aisle of medieval Europe, where desperation met innovation and your taste buds cried for mercy. This wasn't a world of choice. There were no vending machines, no late-night convenience stores, no hot dog rollers humming with synthetic optimism. If you were hungry and lucky enough to have a few coins, or something to trade, you bought whatever was hot, fast, and still mostly recognizable as food. But medieval junk food wasn't made for joy. It was made for survival. The line between meal and medical emergency was razor thin, and often razor sharp. You didn't eat for flavor. You ate to not die. And half the time that strategy backfired. Street food vendors didn't operate under health codes. Their kitchen was a blackened cauldron suspended over an open flame, simmering with yesterday's meat scraps, today's questionable grains, and a floating mystery that might have been a turnip or a rat. No one was quite sure. Men, women, children, everyone ate it, and everyone paid for it, usually with indigestion, vomiting, or a spontaneous trip to the afterlife. But people came back. Every day. Why? Because hunger always wins. Because even if you knew that meat pie was filled with something that had 4 legs last week and maggots this morning, you still bought it. You still ate it. And afterward, when your stomach began making noises only demons should make, you promised yourself you'd never do it again. Until the next day. The truth is, medieval junk food wasn't a category. It was a condition. A moment in the day where hunger beat hesitation. And the toll it took on your body? That's the story we're here to tell. Because these snacks didn't just fill your belly, they rewrote your anatomy. They transformed your teeth into chalky ruins. They turned your intestines into battlegrounds. They made your skin sweat out regret. And yet, somehow, this edible horror show helped define centuries of peasant life. You didn't just survive medieval Europe, you digested it, barely. So before we bite into the greasy specifics of what exactly these people were eating, let's set the tone. Medieval junk food was not cute, not quaint, and definitely not harmless. It was survival food at its filthiest, a culinary middle finger to the modern idea of snacks. This is flavor purgatory, and your only guide is your own poor decision-making. Long before it sat neatly in pastel packets at coffee shops or crystallized into candy canes at Christmas, sugar was something closer to sorcery. In medieval Europe, it was a luxury, a curiosity, a status symbol, and a slow-burning catastrophe for your body. Imported from distant lands at an astronomical cost, sugar arrived in small, rock-hard loaves known as sugar loaves, which had to be chiseled apart like precious stone. Only the rich could afford it regularly, and they flaunted it with the grace of someone showing off black magic. To put it simply, sugar was power. Power to entertain, to impress, and eventually to rot your teeth straight out of your skull. The average peasant didn't even know what it tasted like until it was served to them once a year on a holy feast day, dusted atop a piece of dried fruit, or melted into a vaguely sweet syrup to celebrate survival. Nobles, though? They went all in: candied fruits, sweet wines, preserved rose petals, and even sugar sculptures. That's right, sculptures. Entire scenes molded from sugar for parties, then either eaten or left to slowly collapse under the weight of humidity and hubris. The result? Mouths full of cavities, gums swollen and bleeding, breath that could kill a priest from across the banquet table. Sugar was a statement. It said, "I'm wealthy enough to import my own doom, thank you very much." Physicians of the time were suspicious, noting how it seemed to heat the blood and damage the teeth, but those warnings were no match for the trend. Even the church didn't fully condemn sugar, because it helped attract worshippers to feast days. In the end, what was spiritual salvation if not a spoonful of sweetness to go with it? For the body, though, sugar was merciless. It created the perfect storm for bacteria in the mouth. In a time with no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, and a general distrust of water, sugar clung to teeth like glue, and it stayed there, festering, spreading. By age 25, many nobles had teeth that looked like crumbling gravestones, each molar a dark monument to vanity. They covered their mouths when they laughed. They chewed slowly. And if the pain got too much, they hired a barber surgeon to yank the offending tooth out with a pair of iron tongs while several men held them down. And yet, just like modern junk food, sugar was irresistible. Despite the agony, despite the cost, despite the smell of rotting teeth in every noble court, people kept eating it. Because nothing says, "I made it," quite like losing your front teeth to imported joy. If you were hungry in a medieval town and had a few copper coins jingling in your pouch, you didn't sit down at a tavern with a curated menu and a friendly server. No, you went outside, to the nearest bustling, smoke-choked street corner, where the air was thick with the smell of burnt flour, overcooked grease, and humanity itself. This was where the medieval snack scene lived and festered. The street vendors were as permanent as the cobblestones, each hawking their own version of edible chaos. No licenses, no regulations, no rules, just a cauldron, a pan, and a dream. Street food in medieval cities was fast, cheap, and sometimes even edible. Meat pies were popular, if only because their contents could be heavily disguised by pastry. The crust acted like an edible security blanket, hiding sins like spoiled pork, bird bones, and whatever the butcher couldn't legally sell. There were fritters, flatbreads, roasted chestnuts, and dried fish coated in salt so thick it crunched like gravel. And that's not to mention the infamous penny ale, a sour, low-alcohol beer sold by the mug that tasted like regret and usually carried a mild hallucinogenic side effect. But the real star of the show was street pottage, a steaming sludge served in wooden bowls that had never seen a drop of soap. Pottage was the medieval equivalent of leftovers soup. It was an ever-evolving stew, absorbing whatever scraps the cook had lying around. Cabbage cores, animal bones, root vegetables, barley husks, moldy cheese, all stewed into a consistency that can only be described as medieval gravy. The same pot might simmer for days, growing darker and thicker, like a culinary bog. Add a slice of stale bread, and congratulations, you've got lunch. Of course, it wasn't just about the food. Street treats came with ambiance. Rats scurrying between feet, dogs licking the dirt clean, vendors yelling over each other, and a town crier delivering plague news 3 feet from your snack. It was a full sensory experience. People ate standing up, shoulder to shoulder with fishmongers, pickpockets, and drunk monks. You didn't know what you were eating. You didn't ask. And you definitely didn't want to look too closely. The body, however, noticed. Almost immediately. Stomach cramps were part of the ritual. Gas, bloating, diarrhea, these weren't ailments, they were expected outcomes. People built their daily schedules around how long it took the latest questionable fritter to evacuate their system. And in a world without toilet paper, that was no small consideration. The communal latrines told the tale, filled to the brim with the aftershocks of cheap meat and bad choices. But people still came back, because in the brutal, hungry world of medieval life, street food was comfort. Chaotic, filthy, stomach-wrenching comfort. Now, let's take a sharp detour into the elite version of snacking, where sugar didn't just appear in your stew by accident, but was deliberately weaponized into confections that dazzled the eyes and slowly demolished the body. Welcome to the world of candied catastrophes. These were the luxurious, painstakingly crafted sweets of the medieval elite. Preserved fruits rolled in sugar, rose petals dipped in syrup, almonds encased in honey-glazed shells, and of course, the infamous marchpane, an early ancestor of marzipan, molded into swans, castles, or angels before being devoured like divine snacks of destruction. Candied treats weren't just food. They were art. They were status. And they were often completely inedible to anyone who didn't have a noble's digestion and a gold-plated stomach. You see, the process of candying things in the Middle Ages involved boiling sugar into oblivion, coating fruits or seeds or flower petals, and then letting it dry into a shiny, tooth-breaking glaze. There was no precision, no temperature control, just fire, instinct, and a whole lot of accidents waiting to happen. The result? Snacks that were either sticky enough to remove your molars or hard enough to be used as projectiles in case of peasant uprisings. But people loved them. They gave them as gifts, offered them at weddings, and paraded them out during feasts as edible monuments to wealth. The brighter the candy, the higher the risk of death. Many of these delights were laced with other exotic ingredients: saffron, cloves, musk, even crushed pearls. Ingredients that, while fancy, also introduced an exciting array of heavy metals and toxins to your bloodstream. Combined with spoiled milk or fermented honey, the digestive results ranged from mild discomfort to multi-day purging sessions politely referred to as cleansing the humors. And it didn't stop there. Once sugar entered the scene, it made everything worse. It was added to sauces, meat glazes, and even wine. Imagine a roast peacock, already a digestive gamble, now slathered in sweetened almond paste and roasted again. It tasted like guilt and liver failure. Medieval cooks went wild with sugar not because it made sense, but because it made them look powerful. The guests weren't meant to enjoy the flavor. They were meant to be impressed that such a dangerous thing was even available. What did all of this do to the body? Rot, mostly. These candied disasters wreaked havoc on teeth. Already suffering from grain grit and poor hygiene, gums bled, abscesses festered, and mouths became battlegrounds of infection. And let's not forget the impact on the gut. The sudden influx of ultra-sweet, poorly processed sugars often led to severe bloating, vomiting, and yes, medieval diarrhea. A condition that didn't just ruin your meal, but potentially your month. Still, no one cared. Because in the hierarchy of medieval food, suffering was a sign you had made it. You're waking up in a medieval village. The air smells like wet wood and unwashed everything. You stretch, scratch, and shuffle over to breakfast, which is, predictably, a bowl of warm despair. But you know what goes great with your mush of boiled barley and sadness? A pint of ale. Yes, ale. At 6 a.m. Because in the Middle Ages, beer wasn't just a beverage. It was a survival strategy. Water was for the brave and the soon-to-be-dead. Streams carried every kind of filth from animal waste to decomposing corpses. And since boiling water was seen as suspicious or just too much work, people turned to beer. Because beer had one superpower, it wouldn't kill you, at least not right away. Ale in the medieval world wasn't the rich, hoppy, perfectly chilled delight we know today. It was flat, murky, and weak in alcohol, something between a cereal smoothie and a very bad tea. But it was boiled during brewing, which made it safer than raw water, and that was enough. Everyone drank it. Men, women, children, monks, pregnant women, the sick, the holy. It wasn't a party, it was life support in a mug. And it wasn't one mug a day, people consumed gallons. Some estimates suggest 2 to 3 liters daily, often more. Because hydration had to come from somewhere, and ale was as close to clean as it got. But here's the catch. Even weak beer still contains alcohol. And that meant your average villager was just a little buzzed. Constantly. Not drunk enough to fall over, but just tipsy enough to make poor decisions seem like brilliant ideas. Combine this with a diet low in vitamins and high in spoiled bread, and you get a body in permanent damage control mode. The liver, that noble organ, did its best. But between processing alcohol, managing infections, and filtering the daily toxins of medieval life, it aged fast. By 30, most livers were screaming for retirement. And kidneys? Overworked, underappreciated, and frequently betrayed by dehydration and salt overload. Then there was the bloat. Ale was made with grains, barley, wheat, rye, and those grains weren't refined. You were drinking fiber, chunky, fermenting fiber. Gut flora flourished, bloated, rebelled. People farted like brass bands at a funeral. And gas wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Trapped wind was believed to cause everything from headaches to death, leading to the rise of medieval gas remedies like aromatic herbs, vinegar tonics, and good old-fashioned prayer. Still, no one gave it up. Beer was too essential, too familiar, too wet. It was part of every meal, from sunup to sundown. And on feast days, strong ale made an appearance. Higher alcohol, deeper flavor, and a greater chance of someone trying to kiss the priest or fall into the pig pen. It was celebration and sustenance, health hazard and holy ritual, all in one foamy tankard. Ale was how you survived, until it was how you didn't. There it sat, innocent-looking, golden brown, slightly steaming, a meat pie, the medieval answer to hunger, and a slow, excruciating death. Wrapped in pastry, crust firm from the fire, it promised warmth and satiety. But under that flaky armor lay a world of chaos. The meat inside, questionable. The seasoning, overcompensating. The smell, vaguely threatening. Because a medieval meat pie wasn't just food, it was a culinary gamble, a handheld threat wrapped in dough. You see, meat was a luxury. For peasants, it was rare, maybe eaten on feast days, maybe scavenged, maybe stolen. So when meat appeared in pies, it was never the good parts, not the roast, not the cutlet. You were getting the scraps, fat, gristle, organs, blood, skin. Some pies even featured pigeons, sparrows, eels, and hedgehogs. Sometimes these creatures were already dead when butchered, sometimes not. Sometimes you didn't ask, because hunger made the pie look good. And the crust? It was often inedible, more of a container than a part of the meal, called a coffin. Yes, really. The shell was thick, dry, and designed to seal in the juices, or the pathogens. And yet meat pies were everywhere. Street food stalls sold them by the dozens. Taverns made them daily. Traveling vendors hawked them from carts alongside bottles of vinegar and regret they were filling. They were hot. They masked decay with spice, smoke, and lies. A pie could be days old, left uncovered in a hot kitchen, swarmed by flies, and still sold for breakfast. The crust trapped everything inside: flavor, bacteria, rat droppings, and sometimes a surprise bone. For the body, this was a horror story. Meat cooked unevenly could harbor bacteria like Salmonella and Clostridium, except no one knew those names yet. People just knew they got meat sweats, fever, nausea, and cramps after a heavy pie meal. The worst cases resulted in gut flux, bloody flux, or death by innards, all charming euphemisms for explosive intestinal failure. But meat pies also did long-term damage. With no refrigeration, fats oxidized. Toxins built up. Your gut slowly turned into a battlefield of spoilage and bile. And yet, meat pies were beloved, especially by those who didn't understand how food poisoning worked. The rich enjoyed elaborate versions with pastry molded into birds or animals. The poor just hoped theirs wasn't full of cat. Everyone took their chances, tore into that crust, and prayed for flavor, or at least survival, because in the medieval world a good pie could fill you up. A bad one could empty you out in every possible way. In the Middle Ages, cheese was less of a snack and more of a dare. It was the dairy equivalent of Russian roulette, fermented, unregulated, and often described using words that should never apply to food, like oozing, angry, or alive. Unlike today's gourmet cheeses with carefully monitored molds and temperature-controlled aging caves, medieval cheese was created through the time-honored method of "let's hope this doesn't kill us." You curdled milk by leaving it in a warm spot until something happened. Then you squeezed it, salted it, if you could afford salt, and let it ferment in a cellar, a barn, or somewhere the rats hadn't already claimed. What emerged was anyone's guess. Soft cheese, hard cheese, blue cheese, green cheese, cheese that sweated, cheese that screamed. There was no pasteurization, no food safety, no idea what bacteria were. People just knew it either tasted ripe or it tasted like an insult. But it was protein, it was portable. It lasted longer than fresh milk, which turned sour faster than your mood during a plague. So cheese became a medieval staple, found in peasant lunches and noble feasts alike, lurking between bread crusts and dripping off roasted meats. But the dangers were not subtle. Poorly aged cheese developed molds that weren't just foul, they were toxic. Mycotoxins, listeria, and who knows what else festered in the rind. Cheese was often stored beside meat, fish, and human waste, in pantries shared with flies and vermin. A wedge might sit on a shelf for weeks, accumulating texture, odor, and a visible aura. And yet people still ate it, because hunger made optimists of everyone. Physically, cheese did its damage slowly. Most people were lactose intolerant, but no one had a name for it. They just knew that after cheese, they were either bloated, doubled over, or urgently seeking the nearest cesspit. Cheese-induced flatulence was so common that it made its way into medical texts, described as an imbalance of the humors requiring hot herbs or purging. There were no probiotics, just gritted teeth and silent suffering in a communal hut. And let's not forget the social risks. Cheese was a delicacy at noble banquets, where strong flavors signaled wealth. Nobles boasted of cheeses so pungent they could wake the dead. Guests were expected to nibble politely, even if their nose hairs burned. To refuse was rude. To eat was a gamble. But to vomit in your lord's lap, that was treason by digestion. Cheese in medieval times wasn't an appetizer, it was an event. It tested your stomach, your courage, and your friendships. You never knew what you were getting, but you ate it anyway, because it was food, sort of. And in a world where eating was survival, and taste was optional, even the moldiest, most sinister slab of medieval cheese found its place on the table. Ah, yes, frying. The sizzling sound of oil, the crisp promise of golden texture, the smell of something almost delicious. Frying seems like a modern indulgence, a deep-fried delight best paired with guilt and a soda. But medieval folks had their own version of the fry game, and it was every bit as horrifying as you'd expect. There were no thermostats, no deep fryers, and certainly no understanding of oil's smoking point. Just a pot, a fire, and a prayer that nothing caught flame, including your eyebrows. Oil was expensive, so frying was a luxury, or a last resort. People fried bread soaked in lard, cheese fritters that oozed like medieval lava, and battered bits of fish that had been dead long enough to raise moral questions. The poor used rendered animal fat or drippings collected from roasts. The rich? They had access to olive oil or nut oil, if they lived far enough south. Either way, frying wasn't a daily treat. It was an occasional culinary experiment, often resulting in heartburn and spontaneous introspection about life choices. The street versions were worse. Vendors reused the same pan for days, maybe weeks, without changing the oil. Blackened, rancid fat clung to every item, adding a crust of accumulated sins. Fried eel, fried dough, fried organ meat, all served piping hot and suspiciously crunchy. These weren't fries as we know them. These were food fossils, items fried into submission, and hard enough to break a tooth or a spirit. No napkins, no condiments, just heat, grease, and a rapidly approaching existential crisis. What did it do to your body? Imagine eating fried meat cooked in reused tallow from a pig slaughtered 3 weeks ago, then left on a wooden shelf in 80-degree weather. Now, imagine doing that while constipated, dehydrated, and stressed about an upcoming plague wave. The result? Gut rot. Blockages. Bouts of vomiting so intense they were considered spiritual awakenings. Medical experts at the time wrote about heating the humors and boiling the blood, which loosely translates to, you just deep-fried your organs from the inside out. Despite this, fried foods remained popular, especially during feast days and holidays when excess was the point. Fried fruit pies, fritters with bits of cheese and onion, even battered frogs. If it could hold a coating and didn't scream when you dropped it, someone fried it, and the social pressure to indulge was immense. If you didn't eat fried treats, were you truly celebrating, or just trying to stay alive? Fried food in medieval times was danger in a delicious disguise. It lured you in with warmth and crunch, then unleashed a gastrointestinal vendetta. But people kept eating, because flavor was rare, joy was rare, and anything that could distract from the smell of the privy and the looming threat of death, worth every bite. When you hear the word pickled today, your mind might conjure images of crisp cucumbers in mason jars, gently soaking in vinegar with herbs and a Pinterest-worthy label. Now, delete all of that, because in the Middle Ages, pickling wasn't an artisanal hobby, it was survival with a strong aftertaste of panic. Refrigeration didn't exist, and neither did expiration dates. So preserving food meant dumping it into something that killed off the visible threats and ignored the invisible ones. Vinegar, if you had it. Salt, if you were lucky. Brine, usually. Sanitation, never. Everything was pickled. Eggs, fish, eels, onions, cabbage, turnips, leftover stew, maybe a squirrel if it sat still long enough. The process was simple. Submerge it in a vat of salt or sour liquid, ignore it for a while, and hope you still had teeth when it was time to eat. This wasn't about flavor. This was about not starving to death in February. If it crunched, burned, or made your eyes water, it was considered a success. And if it fizzed when you opened the jar, well, then it was extra mature. But make no mistake, pickled food in the Middle Ages was dangerous. Without temperature control, bacteria thrived under the surface. Clostridium botulinum, the toxin that causes botulism, made regular appearances at the dinner table without anyone knowing its name. People just assumed bad pickling caused God's punishment. Vomiting, paralysis, and death were chalked up to spiritual imbalance or maybe just a bad day. Still, they ate it. Because pickled food could stretch into the hard months. A pickled eel today meant you had breakfast next week. That is, if it didn't kill you first. Bodily consequences were swift and brutal. The heavy salt content led to chronic dehydration, especially in winter when water was already scarce or frozen. Constantly consuming salted and pickled foods turned your kidneys into angry little lumps of rebellion. Blood pressure wasn't measured, but if it had been, it would have been sky-high across the board. Add in the fact that most pickled foods were eaten with stale bread and weak ale, and you've got a digestive system bracing for impact at every meal. Even nobles weren't immune. Pickled delicacies were considered exotic, especially pickled fruits like plums, pears, or citrus preserved in vinegar and spices. These were imported luxuries, stored in clay jars sealed with wax. Sounds fancy, but crack open that jar and what emerged often smelled like someone had lost a bet. Still, guests smiled, nodded, and nibbled politely, even as their intestines whispered their final goodbyes. Pickling was a medieval necessity, but it was also a silent saboteur. It gave people food security and food trauma in equal measure. The crunch of a pickled onion might mean survival. It might also mean spending the next 48 hours regretting everything while clutching your stomach in a damp corner of your hut. And yet, like everything in the Middle Ages, people kept eating. Because flavor was a luxury, but fermentation, that was tradition. Picture this. It's the middle of the night. Your body is sore, your home is cold, and you haven't eaten anything but barley porridge and watery ale for 2 days. You wake up in a cold sweat, partly from malnutrition, partly from rats wrestling near your ear, and your stomach demands tribute. So you reach for a snack, not a chocolate bar, not even a piece of bread. No, you reach for what's left hanging over the hearth, a pig's foot. Greasy, chewy, and questionably preserved. This, my friend, is the medieval midnight snack, hardcore, bone-in, and unapologetically primal. Pigs' feet were common peasant fare. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the animal had a destiny, and if you were lucky, or desperate, you ended up gnawing on something gelatinous and vaguely meaty in the dead of night. These weren't seasoned. They weren't marinated. They were boiled until soft, then left to cool into a fatty, wobbly relic of dinner past. Leftovers, in the most medieval sense of the word. A snack made entirely of texture and a healthy disregard for your digestive tract. The real horror came later. Pigs' feet were made of cartilage, fat, and hidden tendons. Eating one in the dark was like chewing through old shoelaces soaked in gravy. If you had teeth issues, and you probably did, you were in for a long night of gumming your way through swine anatomy. If you managed to get it down, your stomach responded with groans so loud they could have passed for church bells. Grease-heavy snacks like this were difficult to digest, especially without fresh vegetables or fiber to move things along. Your body didn't process it. It mourned it. What did this nocturnal indulgence do to you? For starters, it kicked your already struggling liver into overdrive. Processing fat, especially in large chunks after fasting or a bland diet, led to bile overload. And in medieval terms, too much bile meant the bad humors are rising, which could trigger treatments like leeches, vomit-inducing herbs, or being told to sit in a cold stream and reflect on your sins. And let's not forget the next morning, when that grease congealed in your gut, causing constipation, nausea, or a surprise sprint to the public latrine. Despite all of this, people kept snacking. The pig's foot wasn't just a food item. It was tradition. It was culture. It was a leftover from the only time your family had meat all week. Eating it at midnight was comforting in the way only medieval comforts could be. Vaguely traumatic and deeply familiar. And if you had a little salt or ale to wash it down, well, you might even call it indulgent. So when the hunger hit and the options were limited, the pig's foot was always there. Cold, slimy, chewy. A reminder that in the Middle Ages, even your snacks were survival stories wrapped in skin. In today's world, candy is cheap, cheerful, and found in every checkout aisle. It's a reward, a bribe, a late-night regret. But in the Middle Ages, sweets were a privilege, a shimmering sticky dream you probably didn't deserve, and definitely couldn't afford. For most peasants, dessert wasn't a course. It was a concept. One you might taste once or twice a year, if the stars aligned and your lord had a generous moment, or if you managed to sneak into the kitchen during a wedding feast. What counted as a sweet? Not chocolate, still centuries away. Not candy canes or fudge or taffy. No, the medieval sweet tooth was satisfied by concoctions involving honey, dates, fruit preserves, and, if you were very, very lucky, a touch of imported sugar so rare and expensive it made saffron look humble. Dried fruits soaked in syrup were a delicacy. Apple slices baked with honey and crushed nuts could make a monk cry. Confections called dragées were tiny seeds or nuts coated in a hard sugar shell, used more for displaying wealth than for actual snacking. But the real experience of eating sweets in the Middle Ages? Pain. Physical, immediate, tooth-shattering pain. That's because most people's teeth were already a disaster before dessert even entered the picture. Years of grinding stone-dusted bread, zero oral hygiene, and nutrient-deficient diets left mouths looking like battlefields. A chunk of candied fig could feel like chewing gravel. Even if your molars survived the pressure, your gums might bleed as a kind of biological protest. And those few lucky enough to have remaining teeth, they prized them like relics. One wrong bite into hardened sugar could end your dental career. Even the elite suffered. Nobles who indulged in sweetmeats regularly often had rotting teeth by their late 20s. Their smiles were blackened, their breath apocalyptic. A courtier might keep a clove in their mouth to hide the stench, a desperate medieval breath mint. And dentists? Non-existent. You went to a barber surgeon who doubled as your tooth yanker, wart burner, and occasional hairstylist. Sweet treats were an act of edible hubris, a sugar-coated challenge to your body's defenses. And let's not forget digestion. Heavy sweets, especially when combined with fatty meats and alcohol during feasts, wrecked the stomach. Rich desserts caused bloating, nausea, and what medieval physicians called stomach wind, which could be treated with a combination of herbs, vinegar, and social shame. But no one stopped. Because in a world that offered so few luxuries, sweets were a rare, beautiful mistake. A tiny flash of indulgence in a life defined by restraint. So yes, there were sweets in the Middle Ages, but they were rare, dangerous, and often painful, like love or feudalism. A sugary thrill that whispered, "You don't deserve this," and then proved it. Before sugar took over the world like a sticky colonial fever, honey was the reigning monarch of sweetness. But this wasn't the filtered golden drizzle you squeeze onto toast today. Medieval honey was raw, wild, and filled with surprises, like bee legs, wax chunks, and the occasional wing. It was the only widely available sweetener, and it had many jobs: preserving fruit, flavoring ale, coating roasted meats, and starring in desserts. Honey was a symbol of luxury and utility, a golden promise that your meal might actually be enjoyable. But it was also treacherous. First, the sourcing. Beekeeping was common but risky. Hives were made from straw or logs, and harvesting involved angering a cloud of very territorial insects without the help of a bee suit. Getting stung was inevitable. Getting honey? Not guaranteed. And when you did collect it, you didn't just get the good stuff. You got everything: wax, larvae, bugs, and a strange, fermented smell that suggested you might be fermenting too. Still, people strained it, heated it, and used it liberally. In porridge, in meat glazes, even in medicine. Honey was believed to heal wounds and settle coughs. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it just attracted ants and disappointment. And then there was the rot. Honey can preserve, yes, but only under the right conditions. If contaminated, it could become a breeding ground for botulism. Infant death from honey-related poisoning wasn't rare, though few understood why. They just knew not to give babies too much. But everyone else? They were shoveling it down with roasted lamb and chasing it with wine. Their bodies protested accordingly. Medieval digestion was already fragile. Honey acted like a slow-motion gut grenade. It intensified bloating, gummed up the intestines, and when mixed with alcohol, turned the stomach into a fermenting swamp. But honey's biggest offense? It made things taste good, which meant people overate. A rare luxury, yes, but when honey was around, during holidays, royal visits, or sacred feasts, it encouraged indulgence. Overeating in a world where vomiting was your only option for relief often led to purging sessions, either natural or physician-induced. Think strong herbs, forced gagging, or, in extreme cases, bloodletting to calm the stomach, all because someone enjoyed their honey roast a little too much. Still, honey endured. It was the sweetener of saints, sinners, and scholars alike. It dripped from cheese, soaked into bread, and glazed the meat of 1,000 doomed feasts. But it also dripped into your bloodstream, helped destroy your teeth, inflamed your gut, and gave medieval cuisine a golden hue of delicious deception. The honey trap, indeed. Let's talk about bread. That humble staple we romanticize as rustic and wholesome in modern bakeries with exposed brick walls and folksy signage. Now, travel back 700 years. Medieval bread wasn't served with olive oil or shaped into charming boules. It was a daily necessity, yes, but it was also a dental disaster and possibly a tool for passive-aggressive warfare. Because what you called bread in the Middle Ages might have been one small misstep away from masonry. First off, everyone ate bread. Rich, poor, sick, dying, bread was life. But not all bread was created equal. Nobles got fine white loaves made from sifted wheat flour, the kind that looked almost soft and wouldn't break your jaw. Peasants? They ate something called maslin, a mix of rye, barley, oats, or whatever the millstone coughed up that day. Wheat was a fantasy. Instead, bread was dense, dark, and filled with surprises like seeds, sand, ground-up legumes, and sometimes, if harvests were bad, bark. Yes, bark, as in tree. And if that wasn't exciting enough, consider the grind. Grain was milled between large stone wheels, and fragments of those stones, grit, dust, and microscopic rock, ended up in the flour. This turned every bite of bread into a slow-motion dental apocalypse. Even by the age of 20, many people had ground their teeth into stubs just trying to chew through lunch. Gums receded, abscesses festered, and molars cracked. Medieval dental care consisted of prayers, pliers, and herbal compresses. If your teeth hurt, you were told to chew on garlic or yarrow. If they fell out, well, you were halfway to sainthood. But the real insult was when bread became a trap. During bad years, and there were many, peasants added fillers to stretch their dough. Things like sawdust, clay, acorns, and even chalk. This wasn't innovation, it was desperation. The resulting loaves were heavier than some domestic animals and harder than battlefield armor. Stale bread could be used as a plate, a trencher, soaked in meat juices until it reached the consistency of shame. If you were lucky, you ate the trencher. If you were unlucky, you broke your tooth on it. Bread also turned on your gut. The lack of yeast or poor fermentation led to leaden loaves that sat in the stomach like regret. Constipation was common. Bloating was eternal. And in a diet already low in greens and fiber, heavy bread could back you up like a medieval dam. Physicians diagnosed these issues as blocked humors and prescribed mild poisons, laxatives, or a fast so your bowels could pray for forgiveness. Still, bread was a miracle to the people who ate it. However brutal, however unforgiving, it represented survival. And even as it wore down teeth, irritated stomachs, and slowly fossilized mid-chew, people clung to it like life itself. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't ask what was in your bread. You just hoped you had some. Imagine waking up hungry, again. You shuffle to the fire pit, still smoldering from last night, and ladle yourself a bowl of the household's prized dish, pottage. It's hot. It's thick. It's been cooking for no one's really sure how long. Days? Weeks? It smells like boiled fatigue and tastes like the past. But this is your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Welcome to the miracle of medieval one-pot cuisine. Welcome to pottage, the edible compost pile that fed generations and clogged as many. Pottage wasn't just a dish, it was a lifestyle. Every household had a pot, and that pot never got cleaned. It just kept going. New ingredients were added as old ones disappeared. Barley, lentils, carrots, cabbage, onions, wild herbs, turnips, and sometimes, if you were flush with luck, a piece of meat. The flavor, evolving, the texture, somewhere between stew and swamp. Each bowl told a story, mostly a horror story, but a story nonetheless. Peasants swore by it. Nobles ignored it. Children slurped it. And physicians occasionally recommended it, as long as it wasn't overly moist with melancholy vegetables, whatever that meant. It was food you could eat with a spoon or a piece of bread, or, if necessary, a flat rock. And everyone had their version. Some were watery and bland. Others were thick enough to hold up a knife. Either way, it filled your belly and slowed your thinking to a medieval crawl. But pottage had a dark side. Constantly simmering meant constantly fermenting. Old scraps didn't always cook through. Bone shards lurked in the bottom. Moldy roots added depth. And leftover meat turned the pot into a digestive lottery. Eating spoiled pottage caused everything from stomach cramps and vomiting to full-blown gut rot. People staggered to the latrines muttering prayers and swearing off dinner, until hunger hit again 6 hours later. Nutrition? Marginal. Pottage offered calories, not balance. The body survived, barely. But scurvy, rickets, and other deficiency diseases were never far behind. And yet, pottage persisted. It was humble, adaptable, and horrifyingly persistent. You could stretch it across an entire week or month by just adding more water and ingredients until it developed the consistency of regret and the color of surrender. It was the original slow cooker recipe, minus the hygiene, plus the occasional parasite. But it worked. In a time when food scarcity was a way of life, pottage was warm, filling, and mercifully tasteless. You didn't love it. You didn't hate it. You just accepted it, like cold weather and the smell of goats. And so you lifted your spoon, inhaled the steam, and reminded yourself that survival never tasted good. There are bad culinary decisions, and then there are crimes against taste buds. Turnips and treacle falls firmly in the second category. A dish so baffling, so viscerally confusing, it raises the question, were medieval people okay? The answer, of course, is no. They were starving, malnourished, and running out of ideas. Which is probably how we ended up with this sticky abomination. Boiled root vegetable, barely edible in the best conditions, smothered in the only sweetener available, thick, cloying, slightly fermented syrup known as treacle. Turnips were everywhere. Cheap, easy to grow, and impossible to enjoy. In a time when vegetables were either limp from overboiling or sharp enough to strip paint, turnips stood out by doing both. Bland yet bitter, fibrous yet soggy, they were the edible equivalent of a punishment. But they were plentiful, so peasants ate them. Roasted, boiled, mashed, none of it helped. So someone had the bright idea to drown the flavor in sweetness. Enter treacle, a dark, molasses-like syrup scraped from the bottom of sugar refining barrels when sugar could actually be found. It was pungent, sticky, and made everything taste like someone melted down regret. The combination was memorable. Treacle didn't mask the taste of the turnip so much as wrestle it into submission. The result was a gelatinous mess that clung to spoons and stomachs alike. It sat heavily, coating the tongue in a flavor that defied classification. Sweet, kind of, sour, a little, vegetal, unforgivably, and still people served it as dessert, or dinner, or both, because it was filling, cheap, and technically food. The bodily consequences were immediate. Turnips are high in fiber and starch but low in actual nutrients. Combined with treacle, a dense sugar bomb, they caused bloating, flatulence, and what medieval texts euphemistically called internal disturbance. People belched like harpsichords and groaned through digestion like dying cattle. Still, they kept eating. Because it was warm. Because it was different. Because in a world of stale bread and perpetual stew, even bad food was exciting. Nobles occasionally encountered this culinary monstrosity during fasting periods, when meat was forbidden and cooks had to get creative. The result? Heavily spiced, sweetened root vegetable dishes that no one enjoyed but everyone pretended to. Think turnip casserole wearing a candy costume. It was culinary theater, a performance of wealth and survival. And after all, if you had to fast, you might as well suffer with style. Turnips and treacle didn't endure as a beloved classic for good reason. It vanished into history's compost bin, remembered only in disgusted footnotes and the occasional experimental history cookbook. But for a brief, sticky moment, it was survival food pretending to be a treat, and that might be the most medieval thing of all. The medieval meat market was not a place of clarity or choice. It was a swirling mass of smells, flies, and uncertainty. A stall might display cuts of beef, pork, or poultry, or it might offer mystery meat, a vague term for any protein source that once walked, slithered, or squealed, and was now very, very dead. No labels, no regulations, no questions asked. If it looked edible and didn't bite back, it was sold. That was the rule. You walked into the market hoping for lamb and walked out with weasel, possibly fox, definitely regret. Sellers weren't trying to be dishonest. They just worked with what they had. Leftover parts, strange animals, unidentifiable organs, and more bones than meat. Meat was precious. You didn't waste it. You ground it up, spiced it until it couldn't talk back, and stuffed it into a crust or casing to hide the truth. And voila, mystery pie, sausage surprise, or beast stew. Best not to ask what beast. The stench was legendary. Markets had no refrigeration. Carcasses hung in the open air, sweating under the sun and occasionally sprouting texture. Maggots were common. Rats were expected. Cats were necessary. And when meat began to turn, usually within hours, vendors simply washed it in vinegar or beer and declared it freshened. Some rubbed it with salt, others smoked it. Most just waved the flies off and hoped for the best. And people bought it. Because meat was rare, filling, and associated with strength. Nobles had private butchers. Peasants bought scraps. Offal, the organs, kidneys, livers, and random tissue, was cheap and often flavored with herbs or onions to make it tolerable. In theory. In practice, eating mystery meat was a gamble. You might get a good cut, you might get a spleen, you might get sick. If you were really unlucky, you might get infected. Especially if the animal had died of disease and was harvested anyway. The aftermath was often dramatic. Food poisoning didn't just mean a bad night. It could mean dysentery, bloody flux, or death. The line between dinner and death sentence was paper thin, and yet markets thrived. Everyone needed meat. Everyone took the risk. You ate fast, didn't look too closely, and said your prayers. Even nobles weren't immune. Servants occasionally slipped in bad meat, either by accident or in protest. Entire royal households could fall ill from one bad roast. There were stories, half myth, half warning, about stew pots with ingredients donated by stray animals or recently deceased livestock. Some even whispered about human meat during times of famine. Those were just rumors. Probably. The medieval mystery meat market was capitalism at its most primal. It promised strength, delivered chaos, and left your digestive system to pick up the pieces. Still, people lined up, because hunger is louder than reason. In the hierarchy of medieval culinary disasters, there is one creature that often moved from pest to protein without warning: the rat. Yes, that twitchy, disease-riddled scavenger that scurried through garbage heaps and gnawed on table scraps sometimes ended up inside the actual meal. And not by accident. In desperate times, especially during famine or siege, rats were not only eaten but seasoned, plated, and prayed over. Because hunger has a way of lowering standards faster than a collapsing thatched roof. Most of the time, rats were considered a nuisance. They stole food, carried fleas, and spread plague like it was a full-time job. But when winter hit and the grain stores emptied, rats became an option. They were skinned, gutted, roasted over an open flame, and served with whatever herbs were lying around. Was it dignified? Was it sanitary? Absolutely not. Did it keep you alive for another day? You bet. And even when not purposefully consumed, rats were often part of the food experience. They nested in flour sacks. They slipped into the back corners of kitchens. They drowned in ale barrels, fell into pottage pots, and nibbled meat hung to dry in market stalls. Their droppings? Everywhere. Their smell? Distinct. Their presence? Assumed. You didn't ask if a rat had touched your food. You asked if it was still warm. The effect on the body was exactly what you'd expect. Rats carried parasites, bacteria, and viruses that made meals into microbial nightmares. Accidental ingestion, say a stew with mystery protein that turned out to be a drowned rodent, led to foodborne illness that ranged from fever and vomiting to full-blown hallucinations. Medieval physicians had no clue. They chalked it up to bad air, demonic influence, or a sinful lifestyle. Don't eat rats never made it into medical doctrine. It was too common. And the worst part? People developed a taste for it. In some regions, roasted rat became a known dish, not glamorous, not talked about publicly, but accepted, especially in cities under siege, where cats, dogs, and rats formed the emergency food pyramid. Some noble households even joked about it in private, rat pâté being a sarcastic euphemism for a truly unfortunate stew. But even in clean food, rats left their mark. Fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for the Black Death, were often spread through rat-infested food supplies. So even if you didn't eat a rat, you might still die because one slept on your grain. Rats weren't a seasoning, they were a symptom of rot, of hunger, of a world where nothing went to waste, not even the vermin. They scurried through history not just as pests, but as uninvited dinner guests, and sometimes, disturbingly, as dinner itself. Pastries. The word alone brings to mind flaky crusts, buttery layers, and sweet indulgence. But forget everything you know. Because in the Middle Ages, pastries were not the soft, delicate confections of modern cafes. They were tough, dry, and occasionally weaponized. These were pastries of penance, served at feast days, weddings, and funerals. Each one a lesson in how to make baked goods feel like a sin. Let's start with the basics. Flour was coarse, water was inconsistent, and ovens were unpredictable at best and deadly at worst. Most medieval ovens were communal, stone furnaces shared by villages where bread and pastries were baked in long, smoky shifts. Pastries made here were often overcooked on the outside and undercooked in the center, like medieval lava cakes without the charm. Butter, if you had it, was used sparingly. Eggs were a luxury. So the dough was dense, dry, and structurally sound enough to double as construction material. Fillings varied. The sweet ones, if you could call them that, included dried fruits, mashed dates, honey, or occasionally stewed apples. But sweetness was relative. Most pastries tasted like disappointment dipped in treacle. The savory ones, far worse. They included ground meat, livers, fish paste, and curdled cheese, all stuffed into dough that dared you to finish it. Spices, when used, weren't for taste. They were to cover the scent of whatever expired 2 days ago. Now, imagine eating this after fasting for 3 days. Your stomach was empty, your senses heightened, and this was your reward. You bit into a pastry expecting comfort and received a mouthful of something that fought back. Chewing took effort. Swallowing required courage. Digestion was a gamble. These weren't pastries, they were edible tests of faith. The consequences were immediate. Overstuffed with fat, sugar, and mystery fillings, pastries triggered everything from reflux to sudden, panicked sprints to the nearest ditch. But they were part of ritual. You had to eat them. They marked transitions, Lent ending, marriages beginning, the dead being remembered. They were symbolic, and symbolic food doesn't need to taste good. It just needs to make you suffer in ways that feel vaguely spiritual. Nobles had more refined versions, decorated with almond paste, rosewater, and shaped into birds or flowers. But even they weren't immune to the after effects. Many a royal chamber pot told the story of an overindulgent feast, and the poor, They scrapped together what they could, baking hard little pockets of whatever was left in the pantry and calling it a celebration. Pastries in the Middle Ages weren't about indulgence. They were about endurance, a flaky facade hiding dense despair, and still, people ate them. Because tradition demanded it. Because hunger tolerated it. And because, let's face it, they were still better than turnips and treacle. By now, you understand that medieval people drank ale like it was their divine right, which, in a way, it was. Water could kill you. Wine was expensive. Ale was the in-between. But there was a darker, soggier chapter in this foamy love affair, and it starts when ale stopped being the drink and started becoming the batter. Yes, they cooked with it, fried with it, soaked everything from bread to meat in it. And this marriage of alcohol and calories produced some of the most unforgettable gastrointestinal decisions of the era. Let's start with ale-battered meat. The recipe was primitive. Meat scraps, sometimes fresh, often not, were dipped in a batter made of ale, flour, and herbs, then fried in animal fat or roasted on spits. The result? A crispy crust that trapped every toxin inside like a sarcophagus of flavor. It was hot, crunchy, and smelled amazing. And that's what made it so dangerous. Because underneath that golden shell could be anything. Spoiled mutton, rat, something from the mystery pile behind the butcher's stall. It didn't matter. The batter made it beautiful. Then came the bread. Stale loaves, too hard to chew, too sad to save, were dunked in ale and pan-fried into a kind of proto-French toast. Only it wasn't breakfast, it was survival. And it didn't come with syrup. Instead, you got a soggy center, burnt crust, and a lingering sense of regret. The rich might enjoy theirs with honey or dried fruit. The poor? Just salt and the memory of better meals. Now, let's talk about what ale batter did to your body. First, the ingredients. Ale in the Middle Ages was brewed with wild yeasts, grain mash, and whatever local flavor floated into the pot. It wasn't sterilized, it wasn't stable, it was alive. Sometimes literally. That yeast-heavy batter introduced a bubbling storm into your stomach. Combined with spoiled meat or moldy bread, it created internal combustion on a scale that would make modern doctors weep. Gas, bloating, and cramping were immediate. For some, the experience included fevers and hallucinations. For others, just a day-long visit to the town latrine. But here's the worst part. People thought it was delicious. They believed the ale killed germs, made food light, and helped balance the humors. In reality, it disguised rot with yeast and made your digestive system scream like a Gregorian choir of pain. Still, ale-battered recipes spread. Fish, onions, even cheese, nothing was safe. If it held still long enough, it got dunked and fried. Ale-battered reality was one part hunger, one part hope, and several parts intestinal trauma. It was medieval comfort food with a razor blade inside, and everyone kept eating. Because it was warm, it was golden, and for a brief moment it felt like luxury. Until it didn't. Feast days were the highlight of medieval life. A break from toil, a time to celebrate. A moment when the village came together, not to fight or mourn, but to eat like kings, even if just for a day. But beneath the laughter, dancing, and dubious folk music was a horror show of digestion. Because the medieval feast wasn't just a celebration, it was a direct assault on your stomach, a test of what the human body could endure in one sitting. Spoiler, not much. Let's set the table. You'd arrive half-starved from fasting. Religious or social expectations often meant you hadn't eaten in 12 to 24 hours. And now there's meat. So much meat. Roasted boar, salted fish, stewed hare. maybe even a goose stuffed with something that used to fly. There were pastries and puddings, trenchers soaked in gravy, ale and wine flowing like rivers, and somewhere in the mix, turnips pretending to be edible. The rules were simple. Eat everything, then eat some more. The poor filled their bellies as quickly as possible. No one knew when the next feast would come, or if it ever would. Nobles took their time, working through endless courses while servants brought in swan-shaped pastries and mulled wine spiced with bad decisions. Everyone overate. Everyone paid for it. The result? Chaos. The medieval stomach was not built for this. It was used to bland porridge and hard bread. Now it had to process layers of rich meat, thick sauces, and alcohol all at once. The immediate consequence was what they politely called overheating of the humors. In modern terms, severe indigestion, vomiting, cramps, and explosive exits. Nobles kept basins behind curtains. Peasants made do with the ditch behind the barn. And this wasn't seen as a failure, it was part of the ritual. Some even purged on purpose. Overeating was such a guarantee that herbs like mint, ginger, and wormwood were served at the end of meals to settle the gut. Translation: you're going to feel like dying, and this might help. Medieval medicine books advised bloodletting for post-feast discomfort. Because obviously, what better way to help your overburdened body than draining it? And yet, feast day buffets were loved. They were rare. They were communal. They offered joy in a world of plagues and poverty. Sure, you might vomit behind the church later. Sure, your bowels might mutiny. But for a few glorious hours, you could pretend life was about more than just survival. You could feel full, even if your stomach promptly rejected that idea. It was gluttony, faith, tradition, and disaster all in one. A beautiful bloated snapshot of medieval life. And tomorrow, back to porridge. Caramel. Today, it's the golden crown of desserts, gently drizzled over ice cream, tucked into chocolates, or spun into decorative threads. It's rich, smooth, and safe. Now, let's set that image on fire. Because in the Middle Ages, caramelized anything was a reckless science experiment that combined dangerous heat, unrefined sugar, and a total lack of culinary supervision. The result? Caramelized chaos. Sugar, as you know by now, was a luxury. Imported, expensive, and sometimes treated more like medicine than food. But when it did make an appearance in the kitchens of nobles or monasteries with generous funding, someone always got the idea to melt it. The method? Dump sugar into a metal pan, set it over a roaring fire, and stir with a stick until it started to bubble and burn. What temperature were they aiming for? Unknown. What safety precautions did they take? None. Caramelization was treated less like a recipe and more like a summoning ritual. Cooks experimented with nuts, fruits, even bits of bread soaked in milk and scorched in sugar syrup. The results were often inedible but dazzling. Shiny confections that resembled gemstones and shattered like glass. If the sugar was boiled too long, it became rock hard. If it was too short, it was a sticky sludge. Either way, someone broke a tooth. But the real danger wasn't dental, it was physical. Sugar burns at a terrifyingly high temperature. And medieval cookware was primitive. Iron pots, open flames, and no protective gear. Scalding sugar stuck to skin, and once it did, it didn't come off. Kitchens became battlegrounds. Blistered hands, scorched arms, and full-scale sugar fires were not uncommon. There are recorded instances of entire feasts being derailed because a sugar sculpture caught fire and set the banquet hall ablaze. Dessert, it turns out, was also a potential arsonist. Even when things didn't combust, the results weren't exactly digestible. These treats, often reserved for feasts and holidays, were dense, overly sweet, and filled with impurities. Sugar wasn't refined. It carried traces of ash, dirt, and whatever had been stored in the barrel before it. Consuming a handful of caramelized almonds might result in a rush of joy, followed by a sharp pang of regret. Stomach aches, acid reflux, and the delightful phenomenon known as medieval sugar sweats were common side effects, and yet people loved it. Caramelized fruits were offered to honored guests. Shards of sugary glass-topped cakes, or what passed for cakes. Children coveted sticky apples with burnt crusts and splintered cores. For nobles, it was about prestige. For peasants, it was rare magic. For everyone's intestines, it was war. Caramelized chaos was the high-stakes finale of medieval indulgence. Fiery, sharp, and sweet enough to haunt you well into the next morning. You didn't eat it because it was good. You ate it because it felt like victory. Dairy in the Middle Ages was a test of nerve. There was no refrigeration, no pasteurization, no expiration date to squint at and ignore. There was only smell, texture, and the primal voice in your head whispering, "You probably shouldn't eat that." But you did, because milk, butter, and cheese were staples, or punishments. It depended on the day. Let's start with milk. It spoiled within hours, especially in summer. Medieval milk didn't come in a chilled bottle. It came warm from the cow, carried in open pails, and stored in clay jars that hadn't been washed since your grandmother's baptism. People drank it raw or churned it into butter, or let it sour into a thick, tangy mess they optimistically called clabber. This was consumed by the poor as a drink, an ingredient, or sometimes a spoon-fed dare. Butter fared slightly better. It was churned by hand, a process that could take hours and often resulted in something closer to salted cream. Without refrigeration, it turned rancid quickly. Cooks tried to cover the smell with herbs. Spoiled butter was used anyway. Waste not, want not. And if someone fell ill, well, maybe their humors were unbalanced. Then came the elite's favorite, cream. This was skimmed from fresh milk and served to nobles with fruits, honey, or baked into custards. But cream spoiled faster than anything else. Eating it was like playing Russian roulette with your digestive tract. Some days it was fine. Other days it fermented in your stomach like curdled vengeance. And the consequences? Monumental. Stomach cramps, bloating, and vomiting were routine. Milk-borne illnesses like brucellosis caused fevers, sweats, and body aches that lasted for weeks. Children were especially vulnerable. But there were no germ theories, no lactose intolerance diagnoses, just a vague idea that dairy coated the gut or stirred the bile. Remedies included mint, sage, or if things got dramatic, bloodletting. Even monks and nuns weren't spared. Monasteries often produced their own dairy, and records show entire abbeys being struck down by bad cheese or tainted cream. But no one stopped. Dairy was tradition. It was nutrition. It was proof that you owned livestock or had access to someone who did. It was community. And when it didn't betray you, it was delicious. Dairy dared you every day to trust it, to eat it, to survive it. And somehow, people did. They churned, they curdled, they prayed, and they passed the butter. Bread and religion were deeply intertwined in the Middle Ages, so much so that your daily struggle with food often doubled as a test of faith. Nowhere was this clearer than during religious fasting periods and communion, when church-sanctioned meals could go from spiritual to life-threatening in one blessed bite. Because when you're half-starved, emotionally wrung out, and kneeling in a stone chapel that smells like incense and mildew, the last thing you expect is to nearly die chewing on the body of Christ. Let's start with fasting. Medieval Europe was ruled not just by kings but by the liturgical calendar. That meant Lent, Advent, Ember Days, and dozens of saints' feast days, each with its own food rules. On fasting days, you were expected to abstain from meat, dairy, and anything remotely enjoyable. Fish was allowed, but only certain kinds. Olive oil was acceptable, if you lived within shipping distance of the Mediterranean. Most people defaulted to stale bread, thin gruel, and watery pottage. By the time you reached Easter or another feast day, your digestive system was in crisis mode, underused, underfed, and unprepared for the flood of fats and sugar to come. But the true star of religious food trauma, communion bread. Also known as the host, this thin wafer was supposed to represent spiritual nourishment. What it actually resembled was a dry, unleavened coin with the texture of antique parchment. Priests placed it directly on your tongue, and you were not allowed to chew. Chewing the host was considered sacrilegious. Instead, you were expected to let it dissolve, slowly, reverently, and hopefully without aspirating it into your windpipe. Which, of course, happened all the time. Children gagged, elders coughed, people collapsed in pews, not from divine enlightenment but from poorly timed swallows. But no one complained. Because choking on church bread wasn't seen as a health hazard. It was seen as an act of spiritual intensity. If anything, your near-death experience brought you closer to heaven. Priests even encouraged you to reflect on the moment of discomfort as a metaphor for Christ's suffering. You were chewing on salvation or choking on it. Either way, your soul got a workout. Now add fasting-induced weakness, dehydration from days of abstaining, and the emotional intensity of religious ritual, and you get a perfect storm of nausea, dizziness, and gastrointestinal rebellion. Some fainted, some vomited. Others got creative with herbal remedies after service. Sage tea, mint, even blessed water laced with wine, all to calm the holy havoc wreaked by one dry wafer and a belly full of spiritual emptiness. Still, people returned to the ritual week after week. Because faith wasn't about comfort, it was about devotion. And in the Middle Ages, that devotion extended all the way down your esophagus. Pickled foods in the Middle Ages were not a flavor preference. They were a last-ditch effort to keep something vaguely edible through months of frost, famine, or whatever fresh apocalypse was lurking outside the village gates. Preservation meant survival. But that jar of turnips soaking in murky brine, it also meant danger. Because pickling, in its medieval form, was a risky business with results that ranged from barely tolerable to prepare for violent illness. To be fair, medieval people didn't invent pickling, but they perfected the art of doing it under the worst possible conditions. Without sterilization, temperature control, or a basic understanding of bacteria, pickled food was an ongoing experiment with your gastrointestinal health. Anything could be pickled: vegetables, fruits, fish, even meat. And brine was a generous term. It might be salt water, vinegar, wine dregs, or just cloudy rainwater with added herbs and good intentions. Storage was equally optimistic. Food was kept in unglazed clay jars, wooden barrels, or anything that didn't leak too badly. The best-case scenario? Your pickles were salty, slightly sour, and vaguely refreshing. Worst case? Mold colonies that stared back. The brine bubbled ominously. The smell hinted at chemical warfare. And yet people still ate it, because food didn't grow on trees in February. And that brings us to the danger. Badly pickled food could kill. Botulism, a toxin that thrives in low oxygen, improperly salted environments, was a frequent but unrecognized guest at the table. People simply thought they were cursed when their muscles locked up and their breathing failed. Evil spirits, they'd say. God's judgment. Not, oh, that radish shouldn't have fizzed. The digestive impact was legendary. Salt overload caused dehydration. Sour brine irritated the stomach lining, and spoiled ingredients introduced bacteria that triggered cramping, vomiting, and the dreaded medieval double whammy, dysentery followed by fever. Remedies included fasting, again, drinking wine, or purging the body with herbal tonics that worked only slightly better than hope. Despite this, pickled foods were everywhere. They traveled well, lasted long, and spiced up an otherwise bland winter diet. Nobles enjoyed pickled lemons, plums, and rare spices from the east. Peasants gnawed on brined cabbage and salted onions that made their breath smell like plague, breath mixed with despair. It was culinary roulette, and most people spun the barrel every day. Pickled peril was part of life, a gamble you made for survival's sake. In a world with no fridge and too many rats, vinegar was a kind of miracle. Just not always the kind that saved you. Fruit. The word alone brings to mind freshness, sweetness, and natural vitality. But in the Middle Ages, fruit was less of a treat and more of a trap. It looked innocent. It grew on trees. Sometimes it even smelled nice, but one bite too early or too late, and you weren't enjoying a burst of natural sugar. You were rolling on the ground in a feverish spiral of regret, wondering whether that pear had gone soft from age or from something far more sinister. To start, let's clarify what fruit meant in a medieval diet. It wasn't the year-round bounty we expect today. There were no bananas in January, no apples flown in from across the globe. What you got was local, seasonal, and at the mercy of every weather pattern and bug infestation imaginable. Apples, pears, plums, berries, grapes. These were available briefly and then gone. That meant they were often picked too soon or eaten long past their prime. Unripe fruit was a digestive nightmare. Hard, sour, and packed with acids that turned your stomach into a medieval battlefield. Yet people ate it anyway. Why? Hunger? Curiosity? Or just the complete lack of understanding about what ripeness looked like? On the other side of the spectrum, overripe fruit attracted flies, fermented on the vine, and turned to wine in your mouth. But the wrong kind of wine. A mouthful of spoiled plum might taste like vinegar and hit like food poisoning. Not that anyone had a name for it. They just called it summer fever and braced for the outcome. Speaking of fermentation, fruit left too long often became accidental alcohol. Fermented cherries, wild grapes, and pears were consumed eagerly by those seeking a cheap high. But the line between buzzed and violently ill was razor thin. Natural fermentation also meant unpredictable alcohol levels. One handful might make you giggle. The next sent you to the dirt with slurred prayers and spontaneous purging. Then came the parasites. Fruit that dropped to the ground was rarely washed. It was picked up, brushed off, and eaten. Never mind that it had been nibbled by rats, rolled through manure, or sat in puddles for a day. Worms, fly eggs, and bacterial surprises hitchhiked directly into your intestines. And remember, no plumbing, no toothbrush, no antibiotics. Yet fruit was still considered sacred by some. Apples symbolized purity. Grapes were a gift from the divine. So, despite the risk, people kept biting. Monks made preserves. Nobles grew orchards. Peasants stole apples from churchyards. Because the taste of sugar, even natural sugar, was rare enough to justify the gamble. And sometimes the gamble paid off. But more often, the fruit fought back. Modern nut brittle is a crunchy, sweet indulgence. Delicate, buttery, and politely breakable. The medieval version? Imagine that same brittle, but forged in the fires of Mount Regret, and strong enough to shatter a knight's armor. jawbreaker doesn't even begin to cover it. This was less dessert, more combat training for your teeth. The process began with boiled honey, or, if you were elite and lucky, rare imported sugar melted until bubbling. Into this molten mixture went nuts, hazelnuts, walnuts, almonds, whatever was on hand or hadn't been eaten by squirrels. Then the whole thing was poured onto a stone slab or wooden board to cool. There were no candy thermometers, no cooling racks. You had to guess, often poorly. When it set, it became a medieval brick of misery. Rock hard, uneven, and capable of inflicting dental devastation in a single bite. Nobles had stronger versions, flavored with spices or rosewater, sometimes pressed into shapes. Peasants might stumble across brittle during a holiday or market fair. Either way, it was more of a display item than a snack. Something you showed guests to prove you had access to sugar. Eating it, however, was an exercise in hubris. The first mistake? Trying to bite it directly. Teeth snapped, gums bled, and there was no dentist waiting to save you. If you broke a tooth on nut brittle, you either yanked it out with pliers or let it rot in your jaw until it infected your bloodstream. Medieval brittle had no chill. It took prisoners and left molars as trophies. The second mistake? Swallowing too quickly. Sharp edges could cut your mouth or throat. Small shards could lodge between teeth or scrape your tongue like sweet gravel. Add in bits of unroasted nuts, occasionally rancid, and the digestive results were as jagged as the candy itself. Gut discomfort, gas, and in some cases intestinal bleeding, because brittle didn't always break down. Sometimes it just lingered. Despite this, people loved it. Because it was rare, because it sparkled, because it looked like something only the rich could afford. Children were given tiny pieces and warned to suck, not chew, which inevitably turned into biting contests and emergency dental work performed with a spoon and a lot of yelling. Nut brittle wasn't a snack. It was a challenge, a sugary statement, a medieval power move with a high injury rate, and those who could eat it without screaming, they earned respect and maybe a second piece, if they had any teeth left. Sausages today are comfort food. They're sizzling, savory, and conveniently contained. In the Middle Ages, however, sausage was less a snack and more a dare with casing. It was a gamble, one that pitted hunger against botulism in a greasy tug of war. You never really knew what was in them. You never really wanted to know, but you ate them anyway, because meat, in any form, was a gift. And wrapped in intestines, even better. Let's begin with the casing. Actual animal intestines. Washed, debatable, properly cleaned, probably not. Stuffed with meat scraps, herbs, oats, and sometimes blood, the sausage was then tied, twisted, and hung to dry, or boiled and sold immediately at market stalls. These weren't neat, bite-sized bratwursts. These were bulging, twisted meat tubes, often varying in size, color, and threat level. And the filling? That was the mystery. Ideally, it included pork or beef. Realistically, it was whatever the butcher couldn't sell raw. Tendon, gristle, sinew, and meat, so close to going bad it was one day away from walking off the plate. Spices helped: pepper, sage, marjoram, if you had them. Most didn't, which meant you were chewing through barely seasoned organ sludge wrapped in pig gut. Bon appetit. Spoilage was the real enemy. Sausages could go rancid fast, especially if improperly stored, and let's be honest, everything was improperly stored. No refrigeration, no consistent curing techniques, just salt, smoke, and hope. Street vendors left them hanging in the sun. Cooks fried them in week-old fat, and peasants carried them in cloth sacks for days, gnawing off chunks as they walked. The smell, often suspect; the texture, Variable, the risk? Impressive. And yet people couldn't resist. Sausage was portable, filling, and made terrible cuts of meat palatable. It was the original fast food, greasy, questionable, and suspiciously addictive. And as with all medieval foods, the consequences hit hard and fast. Cramping, diarrhea, a phenomenon known in some regions as meat madness, where spoiled sausage led to hallucinations, fever, and occasionally public vomiting in church. Even nobles weren't safe. Richer versions of sausage, made with veal, exotic spices, and actual quality cuts, were served at feasts and ceremonies. But when improperly prepared, they still posed a threat. Entire kitchens were blamed for bad batches, sometimes even executed. Yes, really, because nothing says treason like giving the king food poisoning from a spiced sausage. Sausages in the Middle Ages were delicious, dangerous, and deeply unreliable. You didn't eat them to enjoy them. You ate them because you had no choice. The gamble was simple. Chew fast, pray faster. Mead, the drink of legends, the golden nectar of gods, the beverage so romanticized by poets and fantasy authors that we forget what it really was. Fermented chaos in a wooden mug. It was sweet, yes, but it was also unpredictable, intoxicating, and in many cases absolutely ruinous for the human body. Mead was honey wine, brewed with water, yeast, and wild ambition. And in medieval Europe, it was both a celebration and a slow, sticky mistake. The process started with honey, rare, valuable, and full of natural sugars. Mix it with water and leave it to ferment. That's it. No sanitation, no temperature control, just barrels of sticky liquid bubbling like a potion left unattended. Sometimes herbs were added for flavor, lavender, hops, even hallucinogenic roots. The result? A drink that ranged from pleasantly floral to I can hear colors. People loved mead because it felt clean. Unlike water, it wouldn't kill you from cholera. Unlike beer, it had sweetness. And unlike wine, it didn't carry the snobbery of grape-stomping nobles. It was the drink of warriors and monks alike. Poets praised it. Farmers chugged it. Brides toasted it. Mead was everywhere, especially in northern and central Europe, where grapes were a fantasy and barley was too valuable to drink. But it came at a price. Mead was strong. Sometimes too strong. The sugar content turned fermentation into rocket fuel. 1 cup calmed the nerves. 2 cups had you shouting hymns at the sky. By the 3rd, you were lying face down in a sheep pen telling a tree your secrets. Hangovers were apocalyptic. Mead didn't gently wear off. It slammed into your skull the next morning like divine judgment wrapped in beeswax. Headaches, nausea, dizziness, and dry mouth that felt like you'd swallowed sand. Worse, homemade mead varied wildly in potency. Some batches barely fermented. Others turned into unholy elixirs that could stun a mule. There were no measurements, no controls, just barrels of booze sitting in smoky kitchens, absorbing every flavor in the air, fish stew, burning herbs, old shoes. You drank it because it was there. You regretted it because it was also everywhere. Monks brewed it. Warriors drank it before battle. Weddings were practically sponsored by it. And funerals? Mead helped make sense of all the sausages that had gone wrong. It was a universal drink, a sticky sweet mistake repeated across centuries and social classes. Mead wasn't just a drink. It was a risk, a romance, a medieval love affair that always ended with regret and a mouth full of bees. If texture is the unsung hero of great food, it's also the villain of medieval cuisine. Nowhere is this more obvious than with that legendary British delicacy, jellied eel. Today, it's mostly the subject of culinary dares and travel show host drama, but in the Middle Ages, it was common and terrifying. Jellied eel wasn't just food, it was a slimy dare from the local river, suspended in a quivering glaze of gelatin and self-doubt. Let's break it down. Eels were cheap, abundant, and easy to catch. They thrived in rivers, ditches, moats, basically anywhere water stood still long enough to start smelling funny. Because meat was expensive and fish were sacred during religious fasts, eels became a reliable protein source. They didn't need feeding, didn't scream when killed, and had the nutritional value of something slightly better than nothing. Perfect for medieval dinner tables. Once caught, the eels were chopped, boiled, and simmered until they gave up their structural integrity. Their natural collagen thickened the broth into a jelly, which was then poured into a bowl and left to cool. The result? Eel meat encased in a translucent, trembling goo. It was eaten cold, with fingers. Sometimes on bread, sometimes alone, sometimes with tears. The texture was what made it infamous. The eel itself was chewy and oily. The jelly, soft, wet, and resistant to reason. Together, they created a combination that coated your mouth and lingered longer than your will to live. People didn't just chew this meal. They experienced it. It clung to the tongue. It slid down the throat with the reluctant grace of swamp water. And yet, for many, it was a staple. Other texture horrors followed. Cow's tongue, rubbery and oddly fuzzy. Blood pudding, iron-rich, grainy, and prone to congealing mid-bite. Tripe, aka stomach lining, served boiled or fried, always with the texture of a wet sponge marinated in rubber. These dishes weren't delicacies, they were practical uses of animal parts and cold-weather fat preservation. They weren't about flavor, they were about survival. And what did all this textural trauma do to your body? Plenty. Oily meats and gelatin-rich broths led to indigestion. Eel-heavy diets caused bloating and, thanks to unsanitary water sources, parasites. Jelly formed from natural bone stock wasn't filtered, meaning it carried whatever bacteria happened to be simmering alongside it. Diarrhea, intestinal worms, and weeks of abdominal storms often followed a meal that dared to wiggle as you swallowed. Yet jellied eel remained on tables. Why? Because it was cheap, it was available, and when cold nights pressed in and you had no wood for fire, nothing stuck to your ribs and your dignity, quite like eel in aspic. Candied ginger might sound like a quaint medieval treat, sweet, spicy, and a delightful palate cleanser. That's only half true. In the Middle Ages, it was also a silent destroyer of digestion and, occasionally, social peace. Because behind that glossy sugar coating was a root so potent it could inflame your throat, churn your stomach, and send your body into a frenzy of hot, tingling confusion. Ginger wasn't just candy. It was a spice with a superiority complex. Imported at great expense from Asia, ginger was precious. It arrived dried, shriveled, and smelling like mystery. Merchants treated it like gold dust. Apothecaries prescribed it for everything from stomach cramps to impotence. And cooks, particularly in noble houses, turned it into sweetmeats, tiny candied chunks boiled in honey or sugar syrup, then dried into sharp, amber-colored nuggets of culinary violence. The outer coating was sweet, the first bite pleasant. But the heat followed fast, a slow burn that spread from the tongue to the ears to the soul. If you weren't expecting it, and most peasants weren't, you choked, coughed, and occasionally cried. Nobles pretended it was refreshing. Everyone else reached for water and regretted it instantly. Ginger intensified thirst, and in an era where clean water was fiction, that was a cruel trick. But the real danger wasn't flavor. It was what happened next. Ginger, especially in candied form, acted as a laxative, which made sense. Spicy food wakes the body up. In this case, violently. One too many chunks, and you were sprinting to the latrine with a vengeance only root vegetables can provide. Medieval doctors embraced this effect. They believed purging was good, cleansing, holy even. But to the average person, it was just another spice-induced betrayal. Still, candied ginger was gifted during holidays, offered at weddings, and carried as a breath freshener. It was luxury. It was style. It was also, often, a lie. Some batches were made with rotten ginger, poorly preserved and moldy. Others were cut with cheaper roots or bulked with flour. A sweet gift might turn out to be a gut punch, but etiquette demanded you smile and chew. Candied ginger was medicine. It was dessert. It was sabotage in crystal form. And if you could survive a handful without breaking a sweat or breaking into a sprint, you earned your place at the table. Just don't stand too far from the latrine. Medieval feasts looked incredible on the surface. Tables piled with roasts, pies, gilded fruit, and towers of sugar shaped like castles. But underneath the spectacle was a buffet of lies. Because most of that food, it wasn't what it claimed to be, and the effect it had on your body, downright traitorous. Let's start with appearances. Medieval cooks were masters of illusion. They used mock meat during fasting seasons, beans and flour shaped like sausages, or fish molded to look like roast chicken. Some dishes were dyed with saffron or beet juice to make them look more expensive. There were pies that, when cut open, released live birds, frogs, or even mice, not for eating, but for shock value. Because nothing says Happy Feast Day like screaming dinner guests and a bird crapping in your wine. Then came the restructured meats, bones rearranged, organs hidden inside pastries, and exotic animals recreated with whatever was on hand. A roasted peacock might be a goose wearing dyed feathers. A wild boar might be pork scraps molded around a stick. These weren't just tricks. They were culinary scams with a heavy helping of deception and indigestion. And the seasoning? Equally misleading. The rich used spices to show off wealth. Cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper. But they also used them to cover up spoilage. Bad meat didn't go to waste. It got boiled, spiced, and stuffed inside something prettier. The result? A dish that smelled incredible but carried the microbial punch of a battlefield latrine. You ate it anyway, because you were poor, or a guest, or both. Your body, predictably, did not appreciate the performance. The clash of sugar, fat, rotten meat, and alcohol sent your gut into chaos. Bloating, belching, fever, and vomiting were common. Guests sometimes brought their own digestive herbs to survive the night. You didn't eat to feel good. You ate to not be rude. Feasts were social theater. They showed off status, creativity, and excess. If a dish sparkled, danced, or sang, it was a success, even if it also killed Uncle Godfrey later that week. Cooks were applauded for spectacle, not sanitation. Presentation mattered more than outcome. After all, if your dinner could tell a story, who cared if it told it twice, from both ends? Feasting on lies wasn't just culinary deception. It was a lifestyle, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, even joy came laced with risk, and every bite brought you closer to applause or the outhouse. The Middle Ages were not kind to your body, especially when it came to fat. It was rare, it was precious, and it was everywhere when it finally showed up. In times of famine, which happened roughly every time someone sneezed at the crops, fat became a treasure. But once it arrived, it was used with the reckless abandon of people who hadn't tasted calories in a week. Let's start with the source. Animal fat, lard, tallow, drippings, was the base of medieval cooking. Butter was rare and expensive. Olive oil, a Mediterranean fantasy. Most households used whatever grease they could render from pigs, cows, or even geese. This fat-flavored soups, fried flatbreads, and basted meat. In poor homes, it was smeared on bread or eaten plain during lean weeks. It kept you warm, full, and dangerously constipated. Frying was the next level. Deep frying wasn't common, but pan frying in fat became a way to add taste to otherwise flavorless food. On feast days, cooks dropped dough, cheese, or even apples into bubbling grease. The smell was heavenly. The outcome? Less so. Grease fires were common, burns were expected, and most fried food was absorbed with centuries-old wood utensils that doubled as flavor reservoirs and bacterial incubators. Now add famine into the mix. During bad harvests, food was scarce. People grew desperate. They hoarded fat, reused it endlessly, and stretched meals with drippings. The same grease used to fry yesterday's eel fritter was used today to baste your bread. It darkened, thickened, and eventually developed the color and consistency of tar. But it was all they had, so they kept frying. Your body, it suffered. Constant fat consumption without fiber or fresh produce led to chronic stomach issues. Bloating was permanent. Constipation became identity. Skin broke out from lack of nutrients and excess oil. Foul breath, sluggishness, and recurring fever were common symptoms. Blamed, of course, on demons or bad humors. Remedies included chewing parsley, bloodletting, or just fasting until your bowels remembered their job. Ironically, fat also symbolized survival. In famine, only the well-fed survived. Nobles flaunted their size as a mark of power. Peasants hoarded scraps. Everyone respected grease. It was the line between hunger and sustenance, between shivering in your hut and having enough calories to haul water. Fat, fryers, and famine shaped the medieval diet. They were the triple threat that kept people alive and made sure they suffered through it. Every fried meal was a victory, every greasy bite a gamble, and every famine just another reason to thank the pig and pray for a turnip. Sometimes you eat to live. Sometimes you eat because it's there, and sometimes you eat candle wax, not as a joke, not as a dare, but as an actual, albeit desperate, part of your medieval diet. Welcome to one of the darker culinary corners of survival, when the lines between food, fuel, and furniture began to blur. This is the candle wax diet. No carbs, no fiber, all shame. Let's start with the basics. In a cold, hungry winter, when the grain ran out, the rats had vanished, and the snow piled high enough to swallow your goat, people got creative. Candle wax was technically organic. It was edible in the loosest, most regret-soaked sense of the word. And in some households, particularly among the poorest or imprisoned, it was swallowed in small pieces to curb hunger pangs or fake fullness. Candles were made from tallow, a rendered fat usually sourced from cows or sheep. It was greasy, smoky, and had a flavor somewhere between rancid butter and scorched regret. But it was calories, and when you hadn't eaten in 2 days, calories were king. Monasteries sometimes used candle tallow in cooking during extreme shortages. Even children were caught nibbling half-melted stubs in the dead of winter. No one judged, because who among them hadn't stared at a flame and thought, maybe just one bite? The physical impact? Catastrophic. Candle wax isn't digestible. It congealed in the stomach, leading to blockages, constipation, and the charming phenomenon known as gut stone, a mass of hardened fat and regret stuck in your bowels. People couldn't pass it. They couldn't vomit it. They just suffered until nature, herbal tonics, or a merciful God intervened. Tallow also absorbed everything from its environment: soot, bugs, hair, and the occasional fingernail. Candles weren't made in sterile workshops. They were made beside fires, near livestock, on open tables covered in dirt and ambition. By the time someone ate a chunk, it was less food and more crime scene. But it dulled the pain. It coated the throat. It gave the illusion of nourishment. Even nobles weren't immune. During sieges, when castles ran out of supplies, wax rations were issued. Soldiers gnawed on candle ends while guarding the ramparts. Prisoners in dungeons lived for weeks on nothing but dripping tallow, waxy crumbs, and the occasional rat if they were lucky. Candle wax wasn't food, it was desperation made chewable. A glistening symbol of hunger so raw it made people consume light itself. And in that moment, with frostbitten fingers and empty bowls, it felt almost holy. Today, emotional eating is associated with ice cream, pizza, and late-night regret. In the Middle Ages, eating your feelings meant chewing through rot, salt, and sadness, often while crying into a bowl of pottage that looked and smelled like boiled remorse. There were no therapists, there were no comfort foods, there was just food. And most of the time, even that was barely comforting. Let's paint the scene. You've buried 2 of your children to fever this winter. Your lord just increased your taxes. The rain hasn't stopped in a week, and your neighbor's goat has been staring at you weird. What do? You eat. Not because you're hungry, because hunger is constant, but because it's the only control you have. You find the crustiest hunk of bread, dip it in weak ale, and pretend it tastes like anything but futility. Food became ritual. Peasants boiled the same stew day after day because it was routine, predictable, safe. They chewed through it slowly, not to enjoy it, but to feel something, even pain. Nobles gorged at feasts, not just out of gluttony, but to fill a void left by politics, war, and arranged marriages. Emotional eating wasn't a luxury. It was a survival tactic. But here's the twist. The more you ate to cope, the worse you felt, physically and emotionally. Because medieval food was harsh, salty, fatty, spoiled, or just plain bland. It weighed on you, literally. Bloating, gas, sluggishness, and cramping were part of the process. And still, you reached for another hunk of bread, another sausage, another questionable fritter. Because in a world where joy was fleeting and comfort was a myth, chewing was the closest thing to hope. Even monks had food diaries, not in the Instagram sense, but in spiritual confessions. Today, I overate bread to soothe my worry over Brother Thomas's heresy. Emotional eating was acknowledged, judged, and even punished. Some were forced to fast to cleanse the soul. Others were beaten or shamed for gluttony. But everyone did it, because suffering with a full stomach felt slightly better than suffering on an empty one. Food was solace, penance, rebellion, and ritual all in one. Whether it was a noblewoman sipping syrup-soaked cherries while stewing over betrayal, or a peasant staring into the steam of their 6th bowl of turnip stew, emotional eating ran deep. It was medieval therapy. Chew, swallow, cry, repeat. In the Middle Ages, every meal was a gamble. Not in the modern, will this be undercooked chicken kind of way, but in a full-on life or death, am I about to meet God via dinner sort of gamble. Welcome to the daily horror known as food poisoning roulette, where the wheel was your stew pot, the stakes were your organs, and the prize was survival, most of the time. Let's be clear, nobody understood bacteria. Germ theory wouldn't arrive for centuries. Instead, people believed illness came from bad humors, spoiled air, or God being mildly annoyed with your behavior last Thursday. So, if you got violently ill after eating meat left out in the sun for 2 days, it wasn't salmonella. It was probably the devil testing your willpower. Meat was the biggest offender. Without refrigeration, preservation was limited to salting, drying, smoking, or just luck. Even salted meat could go rancid. Fish spoiled rapidly. Eggs rotted silently. Dairy curdled into silent killers. And leftovers were routinely reheated days later, often with added herbs to mask the scent of doom. Food poisoning symptoms ranged from mild discomfort to apocalyptic purge. Cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, and hallucinations were considered normal. Many simply called it bad food wind or gastrointestinal turmoil, which sounds poetic until you realize it meant your insides were revolting in iambic pentameter. If the fever didn't break, you might be bled. If it did, you were praised for surviving yet another meal. Street food was especially treacherous. Vendors rarely washed their hands, let alone their pots. Food was cooked, recooked, touched by 10 people, then dumped into wooden bowls that had never seen soap. But people kept eating. Hunger silenced hygiene. The poor were hit hardest. They had fewer choices and less access to fresh food. Stale bread, moldy cheese, spoiled beans, all consumed without hesitation. For the wealthy, danger came in the form of exotic imports. Spiced dishes with questionable meats or preserved fruits that had fermented into sugary traps. Even the king wasn't safe. There are historical records of entire banquets ending in mass vomiting. And remedies? Barely helpful. Vinegar, mint, leeches, and prayers. Sometimes all four at once. No one blamed the food. They blamed sin, the stars, or their neighbor's evil eye. Food poisoning wasn't a surprise. It was expected. A rite of passage. An unscheduled exorcism that reminded you life was fragile, dinner was risky, and your guts were medieval martyrs. In the modern world, indigestion is an occasional inconvenience. Too much coffee, one spicy taco, a regretful midnight snack. In medieval Europe, it was a daily companion, a shadow that followed every bite, every chew, every ladle of oversalted broth. Because everything about the medieval diet, from its preparation to its ingredients, was designed to make your digestive system cry for help. Let's start with the basics. People didn't eat balanced meals. They ate what was available. That meant dense bread packed with grain husks and stone dust. Greasy meats that had been cooked beyond recognition. Pottage thickened with mystery vegetables and leftover bone marrow. And beer, always beer, from breakfast to bedtime. It wasn't a recipe for health, it was a slow-motion digestive disaster. Fiber was uneven. Fresh greens were rare. Fruit was either overripe or sour. And dairy, as you've learned, was a gamble. All of this meant that your intestines were locked in a constant war with your mouth's decision-making. Gas, bloating, cramps, these weren't occasional issues. They were personality traits. Entire villages were probably audible from a distance, humming with digestive unrest like a living bagpipe band of misery. People belched openly. It was considered normal, even polite. A sign that you were processing food, barely. Flatulence, constant. Silent or not, it echoed through communal homes with the regularity of church bells. Indigestion wasn't whispered about. It was shared, lived, suffered through in groups. Remedies included chewing bitter herbs like fennel, mint, or wormwood. Some soaked bread in vinegar and hoped for the best. Others fasted for a day or two, not out of piety, but because they simply couldn't handle another round of food-on-gut violence. The truly desperate visited apothecaries for powders and tinctures with names like bile balm and gas powder, none of which worked. Even the clergy suffered. Monks who brewed their own beer often battled the consequences of heavy, yeasty diets. Nuns wrote about internal rumblings in their personal journals. Nobles consulted astrologers to see if their indigestion was written in the stars. Spoiler, it wasn't. It was written in their sausage. Despite this, no one changed. You couldn't. Food was survival. Taste was irrelevant. Digestion was a battlefield, and your stomach was the front line. Indigestion was not a symptom. It was your constant dinner guest, sitting beside you, quietly judging your every bite. There comes a moment, after a particularly reckless medieval meal, a sausage of unknown origin, a slice of eel pie, perhaps a ladle of pottage that had been simmering for a week, when your body says, enough. Not politely, not gradually, but with sudden, unfiltered vengeance. Welcome to the explosive consequences, the grand finale of medieval digestion, when food exits your body with the urgency of a fleeing criminal. Let's be clear. Diarrhea wasn't just a nuisance in the Middle Ages, it was a killer. Dehydration from fluid loss could lead to collapse, fever, and death, especially in children and the elderly. And without knowledge of sanitation or germ theory, no one knew how to treat it effectively. Let the bowels purge, they said. The bad humors must leave. Leave they did. Violently, repeatedly, and often at the worst possible time. Public latrines, if they existed, were communal and appalling. Most people relieved themselves in buckets, ditches, or behind their own huts. Diarrhea meant being chained to a pit you dug yourself, clutching your stomach and questioning your life choices. If you were lucky, you had a clean rag. If not, straw, a handful of moss, a smooth rock, or nothing at all. Foodborne illness was the most common cause. Undercooked meat, spoiled butter, stale bread laced with fungus. The body rejected it with speed and enthusiasm. Some people vomited and purged at the same time. A process so exhausting it was sometimes described in chronicles as the loosening of the soul. It wasn't poetic, it was terrifying, and yet people expected it. They spoke of the flux with familiarity. Herbalists offered dried berries, charcoal powder, and mixtures of clay and wine as cures. Monks prescribed fasting and prayer. Others relied on folk remedies, heating stones, lying on your stomach, or binding your abdomen with twine. Nothing really helped. Worse, outbreaks were common. If one person got sick from a bad pot of stew, so did everyone who dipped a spoon in. Communal eating meant communal illness. Villages were struck down for days. Work stopped. Fields went untended. Even nobles, with their heavily spiced delicacies, weren't immune. One misjudged roast, and a feast could turn into a gastrointestinal reckoning. The explosive consequences weren't just physical, they were social. Suffering in silence was impossible. Everyone heard it, everyone smelled it. And in a society obsessed with morality, many believed it was punishment for sin. Gluttony, lust, pride, all punished by a very loud, very messy exorcism. In the end, medieval food didn't just betray your taste buds, it betrayed your dignity. It taught you that every bite carried a risk, and that sometimes survival meant sprinting into the woods and praying no one followed. Teeth told the truth in the Middle Ages. They revealed what you ate, how much sugar you could afford, and whether you'd been punished more by poverty or privilege. While peasants ground their molars to dust on gritty bread, nobles gleamed their rotten smiles over goblets of honeyed wine. It was dental hierarchy, etched in enamel. For the poor, cavities were rare. Not because they had great oral hygiene, far from it, but because sugar was scarce and their diets were brutally basic. Coarse bread, root vegetables, occasional meat. But there was a catch. Bread was often milled with stone-ground flour. Microscopic grit mixed with every bite. Over time, that meant worn-down enamel, cracked molars, and exposed nerves. Their teeth didn't rot. They eroded, slowly, painfully. Nobles, meanwhile, had access to sugar, fruit preserves, candied nuts, sweet wine, and dried figs soaked in syrup. All the beautiful, sticky things that promote decay. By age 30, many aristocrats had blackened teeth, swollen gums, and breath so foul it could wilt a tapestry. But this was considered fashionable, a sign of wealth, a display of indulgence. Some even powdered their mouths or used perfumes to mask the scent. Tooth care? Laughable. No toothbrushes, no toothpaste. Some chewed twigs, others rinsed with wine or vinegar. A few nobles used cloths soaked in salt water. But mostly, you just endured the pain. Toothaches were as common as lice. People lived with infection for years, until abscesses burst or the tooth fell out on its own. If the pain became unbearable, you saw a barber surgeon. The same man who shaved your beard would pull your tooth. No anesthesia, no antiseptic. Just a strong arm, a rusty iron hook, and 2 assistants to hold you down. You bit down on a strap of leather. You screamed. You bled. You hoped it wasn't infected. If it was, the infection might spread into your jaw, into your brain, and that was the end. And yet, no one stopped eating the things that caused it. Nobles doubled down on desserts. Peasants chewed through gravel bread. There were no alternatives, no warning labels, no one whispering about cavities in a corner. Your smile was your signature. And whether it gleamed with privilege or grit with desperation, it spoke volumes. In the end, your teeth told the story your words couldn't. How you lived, what you ate, and how long you had before the barber came knocking. There was no medieval hangover cure, no aspirin, no hydration tablet, no hair of the dog cocktail from your favorite apothecary. There was just you, your poor decisions, and the crushing weight of every calorie, spice, and swig you ingested the night before. The morning after a medieval feast wasn't a gentle return to reality. It was a bodily rebellion. First came the dry mouth. Not just parched, desert-level dehydration that made you question whether water had ever existed. Mead, wine, and ale flowed freely the night before, but none of it helped your kidneys. If anything, the alcohol helped you sweat out every last drop of moisture through your pores, along with your dignity. Then the headache, deep, pulsating, and lodged somewhere behind your eyes. This wasn't your average headache. This was a spiritual reckoning. You could hear every church bell, every goat bleat, every echo of your own regrets. You couldn't even curse because your tongue felt like it had been scrubbed with salt and regret. Your stomach? A battlefield. Too much fatty meat, too many pickled vegetables, and a questionable eel pastry meant that your gut was now playing medieval war games with your liver. Bloating, nausea, the kind of gas that could evacuate a chapel. Some tried herbal teas. Others just lay on straw mats and moaned. Then came the guilt. Because gluttony was a sin, the church made sure you knew that. The day after a feast was often a day of fasting, prayer, or shame. Nobles woke up swearing they'd eat lighter until the next feast. Peasants didn't have that luxury. For them, it was a rare indulgence, followed by days of hard labor with aching joints and rumbling bellies. Physical discomfort aside, the emotional aftermath was just as brutal. Who had you insulted in your drunken haze? What scandalous thing had you shouted over roasted swan? Did you dance on the table again? And, most horrifyingly, did you vomit near the priest? These were real fears, whispered behind hands, as everyone pretended not to be dying inside. The morning after was humbling. Whether you were royalty or a ragged farmer, your body reminded you that joy had consequences. The feast was over, The pain had arrived. And next time, maybe, just maybe, you'd skip the third helping of turnip pudding. Spoiler, you wouldn't. In the Middle Ages, snacking wasn't a casual activity. It was a spiritual crisis. Every bite between meals came with baggage, social, moral, and gastrointestinal. You weren't just eating, you were trespassing on divine order. Meals were scheduled, sacred, and structured. Snacking was, well, suspicious. Let's start with the church. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins, and snacking often fell under that banner. Eating outside designated times, indulgent. Eating for pleasure, sinful. Eating to cope, definitely suspicious. Monks recorded their guilt in elaborate detail. Took a fig between prime and terce, felt the devil stirring. Yes, really, but people still did it. Because hunger didn't follow the church's timetable. A shepherd walking the hills would tuck bread into his tunic. A washerwoman chewing a piece of fried dough while wringing out linen wasn't committing heresy, she was surviving. Children snuck dried peas from the pot. Soldiers pocketed salted meat strips. Priests, well, even they nibbled behind altar cloths. And snacks weren't always harmless. They were hard, dense, overcooked, or raw. A hasty bite of spoiled cheese or a handful of old nuts could ruin your week. But the sin wasn't in the bacteria, it was in the appetite. Spiritual advisors warned against eating without need. Hunger was fine. Satisfaction? Dangerous. There were exceptions. Fasting days sometimes allowed collations, small portions to keep you upright. But even these were monitored. Too many figs, too much honey, too large a crust of bread, and suddenly your piety looked suspiciously indulgent. Snacking became a slippery slope toward damnation, bloating, and confessional lines stretching out the chapel doors. And yet, despite the judgment and the risk, everyone snacked. Because life was hard, food was fleeting, and even a mouthful of warmth could feel like salvation. Whether it was a bite of onion, a crust of bread, or a slurp of ale on the sly, snacking reminded people they were alive, even when everything else tried to kill them. So yes, to snack was human. It was weak, it was sinful, it was glorious. And in a world where meals were often punishments and feasts came with consequences, the stolen bite in the middle of the day might have been the most honest moment of joy anyone ever got. Nostalgia is a funny thing. In modern times, we look back at the Middle Ages with an oddly romantic lens. Stone cottages, hearth-cooked meals, and simpler living. But nostalgia has a terrible sense of smell. Because if there's one scent that truly defined medieval snacking, it wasn't fresh bread or roasting meat, it was rot. Thick, sour, unmistakable rot. The air carried it, the food absorbed it, and your memory did its best to forget it. Let's be honest, refrigeration didn't exist. Preservation was rudimentary. Smell was the only line of defense between food and poison, and even then, people's tolerance was heroic. Slightly off, eat it anyway, very off, add vinegar. Completely unrecognizable, feed it to the dog if the dog didn't run. The concept of expiration dates was a dream nobody had yet. Mold was not a warning, it was a flavor note. Smell permeated everything. Cheese that could knock out a mule. Fish that hadn't so much been cured as embalmed. Meats hung until the surface changed color, texture, and in some cases shape. The kitchen stank, the larders stank, the people stank. And still, the smell of food, no matter how decayed, was deeply associated with comfort. Because that's the contradiction. Rot meant survival. If food was rotting, it meant you had food. A sour smell in the house meant dinner was coming. The bubbling pot of pottage in the corner, now in its third week of fermentation, was both a hazard and a symbol of plenty. Rotten turnips? Pick off the soft bits, moldy bread, scrape the top, rancid butter. That's what salt is for. And yet these smells created memories. Children remembered the pungent aroma of boiling cabbage as warmth. Adults associated stale ale and garlic with celebration. Even the smell of burnt animal fat, acrid, greasy, inescapable, meant the fire was on and food was being made. Over time, the human mind reshaped those odors into markers of home. Safety, family. Of course, that doesn't mean the body liked it. People grew accustomed to nausea. Headaches from spoiled air were common. Overpowering food, smells mixed with smoke, sweat, and livestock to create a nasal apocalypse. But you didn't complain. Complaining didn't fix your hunger. You just breathed through your mouth and hoped today's meal wouldn't hiss back. The smell of rot became a part of life. It clung to walls, clothes, and memories. And when we remember the cozy medieval kitchen, we forget that the fragrance of nostalgia probably included the faint aroma of death. In the modern world, "you are what you eat" is motivational. In the Middle Ages, it was a death sentence. Because what you ate, gritty bread, spoiled meat, fermented vegetables, and stagnant water, didn't just shape your health. It shaped your bones, your skin, your breath, your body odor, your lifespan, and probably your personality too. Start with the basics. Bread formed the base of nearly every meal, and that bread often included flour ground with stone, meaning you were essentially chewing on sandpaper. Over time, your teeth filed down, your jaw ached, and you developed infections that spread to your bloodstream. So, yes, you became your bread. And your bread hated you. Meat? If you were lucky, you got some. If you were really lucky, it hadn't turned gray or purple yet. Most meat was old, salty, and smoked into leather. Your kidneys bore the brunt. Your joints swelled from the constant salt overload. Your liver wept silently every time you gnawed on a jerky log with the texture of sadness. Vegetables? Often overboiled, underwashed, and vaguely fungal. You absorbed trace nutrients, yes, but you also ingested dirt, bugs, and the occasional worm. It built character, and gastrointestinal issues. Fruit was seasonal and dangerous, unripe, overripe, or somewhere in between. Fresh meant infested. Preserved meant fermented. Either way, you paid the price. Let's not forget dairy. You drank milk that was half clabber, smeared butter with the consistency of glue, and aged cheese that could legally qualify as a biological weapon. Calcium? Maybe. Parasites? Definitely. And then there was ale, your primary hydration source. Always mildly alcoholic, always mildly contaminated. By 30, your organs had resigned, and your blood sugar levels were on a pilgrimage to nowhere. The result? You looked and felt like your food, bloated, gassy, malnourished, and tired. Your skin had the pallor of flour paste. Your breath could peel bark. Your nails were brittle, your bones porous. And you didn't walk, you creaked. You weren't so much a person as you were a meat vessel powered by root vegetables and desperate hope. But everyone else was the same. So no one noticed. You all shuffled through life together, shaped by your rations and defined by your diet. You were what you ate. Unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, death didn't always arrive in the form of swords or plagues. Sometimes it came on a silver plate. One bite too many, one meal too spoiled, one treat too fermented, and your next trip was to the churchyard, not the market. Because in a world with no expiration dates, no safety standards, and a diet that doubled as slow poisoning, your final moment might very well begin with a crust of bread. The most common culprit? Bad meat. a bit of spoiled pork or undercooked mutton, served at a feast or sold by a smiling butcher with no nose for freshness. You ate it, you smiled. Then, hours later, you were doubled over, cold sweat running down your back, whispering prayers as your body tried to purge the demon now residing in your colon. But meat wasn't the only assassin. There were deadly mushrooms mistaken for safe ones, berries picked off the wrong bush, rye bread infected with ergot, a hallucinogenic fungus that caused seizures, gangrene, and screaming fits so intense they were mistaken for demonic possession. And of course, improperly stored grains that bred invisible molds, leading to vomiting, respiratory failure, or slow, creeping madness. Even the water was out to get you. A cool drink from a stream after a salty stew might seem like relief, until the parasites introduced themselves with fevers and hallucinations that had you trying to confess your sins to a goat. And since beer was safer but always mildly intoxicating, many couldn't tell whether they were being poisoned or just very drunk. Medical treatment didn't help. Bloodletting, leeches, herbal compresses, and enough vinegar to pickle your soul, none of it worked. A priest might be summoned. A neighbor might volunteer to chant over your body. But if the food had already done its job, there was nothing to be done but lie down, groan poetically, and prepare for your final bowel movement. Sometimes death was fast. Other times it took days. A noble might linger, pale and gasping, with servants wiping their brow and whispering about cursed meat pies. A peasant might crawl behind a barn and die quietly, stomach bloated like a rotten melon. Either way, the cause was the same. Something you trusted. Something that looked like a meal turned on you. And still, people kept eating. Because hunger doesn't remember risk. Appetite doesn't fear death. It just opens its mouth, chews, and prays that this next bite isn't the one that writes your name in the Abbey's burial ledger. And here we are. You've walked the dirty streets, stepped over rat droppings, gnawed on stale bread, suffered through sausage roulette, and barely survived turnips and treacle. You've chewed through history's leftovers, stomach churning, tongue scorched, dignity long since abandoned. So let's take a moment to say this. Congratulations, you've tasted the past, and you're still alive, sort of. What have we learned? That medieval junk food wasn't a treat, it was a test. That flavor was often an accident. That preservation meant salt, survival meant guessing, and indulgence meant pain. Every meal was a negotiation between hunger and risk, joy and regret. And no matter how bad it got, how spoiled, how crunchy, how rotten, they kept eating, because they had to. And so much of it, for all its horror, was deeply human, the craving for comfort, the joy in rare sweetness, the ritual of food shared in silence or celebration. Yes, their snacks were deadly, their diets a minefield. But in every pie crust, every moldy hunk of cheese, every wormy apple, there was something familiar, the need to feel full, to feel alive, even just for a minute. Today, we snack for pleasure. Back then, they snacked for survival. And still, despite the filth, the danger, the disease, they found moments of happiness. Laughter at feasts, pride in hard-earned meals, stories told over beer and burnt bread. The Middle Ages weren't just about pain, they were about endurance, and every greasy bite, every awful stew, every desperate grab for pottage proved it. So when you open your fridge tonight and see fresh fruit, safe meat, and clean water, maybe take a second to whisper thank you to the ancestors who paved the way with intestinal suffering, who died for the lack of a decent fridge, who gave their last breath trying to swallow a meat pie stuffed with lies. Thank you for taking this journey through history's unappetizing underbelly. you've earned your place at the table. A modern table with forks and napkins and food that probably won't kill you. Probably